Number 5. Janice Garrison. Hugh Garrison met his wife, Janice, in high school in the 1970s. In 1997, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. November 29th of that year was the Saturday of Thanksgiving. Hugh and Janice spent the day away from their home, which was a log cabin in Stony Point, Virginia. They returned home at 4:30, and when they got inside their cabin, they heard gunshots. They knew the shots came from hunters using the woods on their property. Hunters weren't supposed to be on their property, and there were signs posted all over the woods that said "No hunting allowed." Hugh grabbed his handgun, which he was licensed to carry because he was a private investigator. He went to the edge of the woods, and he yelled out that the woods were private property and there was no trespassing allowed. He also said that he had a gun and he would fire back. He then fired one shot into the air. When he turned to walk back to the cabin, he saw his wife Janice laying on the ground. Someone hiding in the forest shot her in the head and killed her. Hugh didn't even know that she had followed him outside. Hugh called the police and roadblocks were set up quickly. The police found a group of hunters in the forest and only one person was arrested, a man named Glenn Scott Snow. Snow was arrested because he was a convicted felon and he was in possession of a firearm. Snow swore he didn't shoot Janice. He volunteered to take multiple polygraph tests and he gave his gun to the police. It was tested for ballistics and it wasn't the same gun that killed Janice. Hugh's gun was also tested and it wasn't the murder weapon either. The murder weapon has never been recovered and no one has ever been charged in Janice's death. Snow was sentenced to 36 months in prison on the weapons charges, and he was released from prison in 2002. Hugh Garrison continued to live in the cabin after his wife died. He says that she was shot in the head intentionally, while the police say that can't be forensically proven. Hugh also says that it feels like his wife was stolen from him after she only lived half her life, and hopes that one day the killer will be brought to justice. Number 4. The Lava Lake Murders. In the fall of 1924, 50-year-old Edward Nichols, 35-year-old Roy Wilson, and 25-year-old Dewey Morris moved into a log cabin near Little Lava Lake in Oregon. The cabin was owned by a local logging contractor, and the men planned to do some trapping throughout the winter. Around Christmas, Nichols traveled to the city of Bend and sold some furs. On January 15, 1925, a man traveling on snowshoes stopped off at the cabin and he spent the night. He said that the three men were in good spirits and they were having a successful winter. In spring 1925, the families of the men became concerned because no one had seen them in several months. On April 13th, a group of people traveled to the cabin to check on the men's well-being. They immediately noticed that something was wrong because the men's traps hadn't been attended to for quite some time. Inside the cabin, they found the table set for dinner and burnt food on the stove. The owner of the cabin had 5 valuable foxes, which he kept in pens near the cabin. In return for staying in the cabin, the men were supposed to feed the foxes. When the searchers got to the pens, they found the doors open and the foxes were gone. The only thing that they found in the fox's pen was a bloody hammer. The men's sled was also missing. At this point, the searchers decided to contact the sheriff. The next day, the sheriff's investigators found the missing sled. It was about a quarter of a mile away from the cabin on the shore of Big Lava Lake. When they examined the sled, they found a large blood stain. They also saw a depressed path in the snow leading out to the lake. The path came to an end where someone had cut a hole in the ice earlier in the winter and the hole froze over. Upon further searching, they found blood on the snow near the shore, some human hair, and a human tooth. Later that evening, the searchers went to the lake to catch some fish for dinner. When they arrived at the lake, they were surprised to see that much of the ice had melted. The thawing exposed the 3 bodies, and they were all floating on the surface of the lake. The men had all been shot at close range with a shotgun, a pistol, and beaten with a blunt instrument, presumably the hammer. The police had one suspect in the case, a man named Charles Kimsey, who also went by the name Lee Collins. According to the owner of the cabin, Kimsey had spent the winter before the murder trapping with Nichols. They got into a fight when Nichols accused Kimsey of stealing a wallet. Kimsey said that one day he would return to the cabin to kill Nichols. The police were also aware of Kimsey. He had a long criminal history, and he had also been arrested in 1923 for attempted murder. He hired a man named W.O. Harrison to drive him from Portland to Idaho. Along the way, Kimsey pulled Harrison off the stagecoach, punched him, and tied him up. He then threw Harrison down a well and then continued on his journey in the manned stagecoach. Harrison survived the attack, and Kimsey was arrested. He avoided prosecution because he fled before the trial. Kimsey was wanted for questioning for the cabin murders, but it would be 9 years before he was found. He was arrested in Montana, and without even being asked about it, he denied committing the cabin murders. There was no evidence linking Kimsey to the murders, and he had a passable alibi that he was in Colorado at the time of the murders. As a result, he was never charged in the murders of the three men. Kimsey was also wanted in Utah for a murder that was similar to the assault that he committed on W.O. Harrison. The state of Oregon chose not to extradite him, and instead he was charged with the attempted murder of Harrison. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Today, the murder of the men in the cabin on Little Lava Lake is considered officially unsolved. Number 3. Deborah Wolfe. On the day after Christmas in 1985, 28-year-old Deborah Wolfe was working as a nurse at the Veterans Administration Medical Center in Cumberland County, North Carolina. At the end of her workday, she called her mother and told her that she was heading home. Wolfe then drove to her home, which was an isolated cabin located about 4 miles outside of Fayetteville. The next morning, Wolfe didn't show up for work, and one of her co-workers contacted her parents. The co-worker and her parents went to the cabin, and they made some unusual discoveries. Wolfe kept her property neat and tidy, and she always took care of her 2 dogs. So her parents and her co-worker were surprised to find beer cans lying around the yard, and her dogs were running loose and they hadn't been fed. In her cabin, they found her crumpled nurse's uniform on the kitchen floor. It was as if she got undressed as soon as she got home and she threw her uniform on the ground. Her purse wasn't in its usual place, it was stuffed under her bed. Finally, Wolfe was nowhere around. Her parents called the sheriff's department, and they told them that they wouldn't start searching for her until she had been missing for 3 days. After calling the sheriff's department, they noticed that there was a message on her answering machine. This is a recording of the actual message.
Hey Deb, missed you here at work today. Just wondering how you doing. If you're able to give me a call up here at the ward, I'm at 822-7007, or give me a call at home tonight. You've been out a lot of days. Maybe worried when you miss another one. Just want to make sure you're okay. Bye.
Her parents thought that the message was unusual because it was left earlier in the day, and the man said that Wolfe missed a few days of work, but her parents knew that she was at work the day before. Although the sheriff's department said that they would start looking for Wolfe after she was missing for 3 days, they actually waited 5 days to begin their search. Then they finally brought some bloodhounds to her property and looked around the cabin, but they didn't find anything. Boles Family became frustrated with the sheriff's department, so they hired a diver with search experience to look in a pond near the cabin. After looking around the pond for a few minutes, he saw drag marks and 2 sets of footprints in the mud at the edge of the pond. Not long after he went under the water, he resurfaced, and he announced that he found Wolfe's body. She was inside a 55-gallon barrel with holes in it, about 30 feet from the shore, in about 5.5 feet of water. The diver said that her eyes and her mouth were closed and her arms were relaxed at her sides. The autopsy said that Wolfe had drowned, but the medical examiner didn't know if the death was an accident or a homicide. The police, on the other hand, quickly ruled the death an accident. They said that Wolfe was playing with her 2 dogs and one of them may have ventured out into the pond. Wolfe went into the pond to save the dog, and the cold water disoriented her, and then she drowned in 5.5 feet of water. Their explanation for how she got into the barrel is that the diver made a mistake because they didn't find a barrel in the pond. Wolfe's family was shocked by their conclusions. The diver said that he was sure that Wolfe's body was in a barrel because that is not something you mistakenly see. The family also said that there was a barrel missing from Wolfe's property. They found indentations from a barrel in the ground near the cabin. Then, months later, Wolfe's mother was able to see the clothes that she died in. Her mother didn't recognize any of the clothes, and none of it would have fit Wolfe. She was wearing men's shoes that were too big, her pants were too long, and her bra cup was 3 sizes too large and 2 sizes too big around. Her family believes that she was attacked and stuffed into the barrel. They think that she was already dead or dying when the barrel was pushed into the water. This would explain why her body looked relaxed in the barrel, instead of looking like she was trying to claw to get out of the barrel. They also think that the man who left the message on her answering machine is responsible for her murder. The man who called was a volunteer at the hospital, and he wanted to start a romantic relationship with Wolfe, but she made it clear that she wanted to be nothing more than friends with the man. The sheriff's department interviewed the man who left the message, but since they considered Wolfe's death an accident, he was never charged. Not long afterwards, he moved out of the state, and his whereabouts are currently unknown. The sheriff's department considers the case closed, but Wolfe's family thinks that they are wrong, and the killer is still out there. Number 2. Amy and Scott Fandel. On the night of September 4th, 1978, 8-year-old Amy and 13-year-old Scott Fandel were at a bar with their mother, Margaret, and their aunt, Kathy Schoenfelder, in Sterling, Alaska. At around 10 p.m., the adults dropped off the kids at home, which was a 2-bedroom cabin in a remote wooded area, and then Margaret and Schoenfelder returned to the bar. After they left for the bar, Amy and Scott went over to the home of the Luptons, who were their neighbors, to play with the Lupton children. They only stayed a short time, and at 11:45 p.m., a different neighbor saw that a light was on in the Fandels' cabin. Sometime between 2 and 3 a.m., Margaret and Schoenfelder returned home to the cabin. They noticed that all the lights were off, which they thought was weird because the children were afraid of the dark. On the counter, there was a can of tomatoes and a package of macaroni and cheese. What happened next is a bit unclear. Either both adults went to bed without checking in on the children, or they did check in on them and found the beds empty, and they just assumed that they were sleeping at the neighbor's house. The next morning, the children's mother, Margaret, went to work while Schoenfelder slept in. Sometime during the morning, Margaret called the school to speak with Amy, but the school said she wasn't there. When she found out that her 8-year-old daughter hadn't made it to school, she tried to leave work, but her boss wouldn't let her leave. When school came to an end, the Lupton children went over to the Fandels' cabin to see why Amy and Scott weren't in school. That's when Schoenfelder learned that Amy and Scott hadn't spent the night at their house. Schoenfelder called Margaret with the news, and Margaret called the police. The cabin and their property were searched. The police found out that the lock on the front door didn't work, so the kidnapper probably just let him or herself in. There were also bullet casings found outside of the house, but it's unclear if they are connected to the abduction or not. One suspect in the case was Amy's biological father, but he was living in Arizona at the time, and the police quickly ruled him out. Another theory is that someone who was at the bar that night heard that the children would be home alone and kidnapped them. However, that is only a theory, and no one is sure what happened to Amy and Scott Fandel. On the screen now is an age-progressed photo of what Scott may have looked like in 2011 and what Amy may have looked like in 2016. Their family still holds out hope that they are alive, but it has been 40 years since anyone has seen or heard from them. Number 1. The Boles Family. On the morning of Monday, August 16, 1965, Hester Boles of Fountain Valley, California, was getting a sickening feeling in her stomach. On Friday, her son, 41-year-old James Boles, went with his 37-year-old wife, Darlene, and their sons, 13-year-old Bobby and 12-year-old Tommy, to their newly constructed cabin in Crestline, California. They were supposed to phone her on Sunday when they returned. She called his workplace, but James didn't come into work that day. Hester got in touch with Darlene's family, and they hadn't heard from her either. They were getting panicked too, because they were sure that Darlene would have called when they returned from the cabin on Sunday. The family bought the property that the cabin was built on 10 years before, but construction on it had just been completed the weekend before. This trip was the first time that the family would be staying in the cabin, so they thought that Darlene would have phoned to tell them about it. There was no phone at the cabin, so their family couldn't call to check on them. Darlene's brother phoned the sheriff's department, and they said that they would radio the Crestline substation. The problem was that they had a large area to cover, and there were not many deputies, so it was going to take a while for them to go check in on the cabin. Hours went by and Darlene's brother became more and more frustrated, so he and one of his employees drove 75 miles to Crestline to check on the family. They arrived at the 2-bedroom cabin around 4:15, and the family's car was not there. When the brother looked into the living room window, he made a horrifying discovery. On the couch was the family's dog. It was dead and covered in blood. The brother tried the front door, and it was unlocked. When he opened the door, he was hit by a powerful stench. He ventured into the house, and in the master bedroom, he discovered the body of James and 13-year-old Bobby on the floor beside the bed, and in the closet was the body of his sister, Darlene. He ran from the cabin, got into his car, and drove to the sheriff's department. Detectives and sheriff's deputies arrived at the cabin within hours. By all accounts, the bedroom was a horrifying crime scene. James was lying on his back on the floor, and Bobby was in a sitting position with his back against the wall. Darlene was in the closet, and behind her body was 12-year-old Tommy. The positions of their bodies indicate that Darlene was probably trying to hide or protect her youngest son. The investigators found over 35 .22 caliber casings throughout the cabin. Each member of the family had been shot multiple times. The gun has never been found, but FBI tests said that it was a .22 caliber auto-loading pistol or rifle made by High Standard Manufacturing Company. The cartridges were made by the Federal Cartridge Company of Minneapolis. The family's car was found abandoned the next day, not far from the cabin. The Boles were last seen alive on Saturday evening. A woman in Crestline was giving out rat poison on behalf of the local police, and she said that the Boles family stopped by her house on Saturday evening. She said that they had to hurry because they were meeting someone at 8 p.m. There were also several neighbors who thought that they saw a second car at the Boles cabin on Saturday night. Other neighbors remember hearing a barking dog and a woman screaming on Saturday evening, but no one heard the 35-plus gunshots. The family's car was still in the driveway at 6:30 a.m. on Sunday, but it was gone later that morning. The home invasion was a brutal massacre, and it seemed motiveless. There were several suspects over the years, but the most promising suspect came to the attention of the police in December 1966 because of a Be on the Lookout report from the police in Mobile, Alabama. They were looking for a man named George Robert Stewart, who was 26 at the time. Stewart was wanted for the stabbing death of a pair of brothers named Michael and Randall Evans, who were 9 years old and 13 years old respectively. Stewart had been committed to mental institutes several times throughout his life, and he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. He was also a religious fanatic, and at the time of the Boles murders, he was working at a church camp in Twin Peaks, which is about 2 miles away from the Boles cabin. On the weekend that the Boles were murdered, the camp was canceled, and no one from the church was at the campgrounds. This would have given Stewart freedom to do whatever he wanted around the camp. Stewart was finally arrested in April 1967 in Texas. While in custody, he said that he killed one of the Evans brothers, but he denied killing the Boles family and swore that he never killed a dog in his entire life. He was given a polygraph test, and he was asked about killing the Boles. The results of the test showed that he was being deceptive in regards to killing a person. The problem the tester had was that he couldn't tell if Stewart was reacting to the murder of the Boles family, or the murder of the brothers, or another homicide. The police also found a boot print in blood at the cabin, and it was similar to Stewart's boot, but the tread pattern didn't match. In the end, Stewart wasn't charged with the murders of the Boles or the murders of the Evans brothers. Stewart had an airtight alibi for the time of the murders of the Evans brothers. He was in New Orleans at the time. He had a work stub and witnesses backed up his alibi. Instead, he was convicted of child molestation and sexual abuse in October 1993 in Illinois. He was eligible for parole in 2014, and he is currently living in Chicago. So while Stewart has a history of sexual abuse towards children, he has never been convicted of any murders. So how likely is it that he would break into a random family's cabin, force them into the bedroom, and shoot them all multiple times? Some investigators thought that the overkill could have stemmed from something personal. Something else to consider is that James told some locals in Crestline that he and his wife were planning on retiring and they were going to make the cabin their permanent residence. The couple made $10,236 a year, which is about $80,000 today. So they were comfortable, but they certainly weren't rich. Yet they owned 2 fairly new cars, a cabin in Crestline, a condo in Fountain Valley, plus 3 other properties in Los Angeles County. On the night that they died, the family was supposed to meet someone at their cabin at 8 o'clock. Was that person their killer? Was the killer somehow connected to their money? Or were the Boles just excellent investors? Unfortunately, these questions may never be answered, and the brutal slaying of the Boles family may never be solved. Thanks for watching this week's video. If you found it interesting, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. We post a new video every Sunday. Of course, thanks to everyone who already does subscribe. Please also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We may even follow you back. But that's all for this week. Thanks again for watching.